Want to welcome here in studio Mr. Dan Perry, International Affairs Analyst, former Europe and Middle East Editor at the Associated Press, and our very own Robert Swift, I24 News Senior Correspondent. Thank you very much, gentlemen. At this point in time, is there any need for any agreement of sort if the nuclear facilities are all gone?
Of course there's a need.
There is.
Because obviously, and it's not just about the nuclear weapons. What happened over the past 12 days or so should have focused Iran's mind on the reality that to have negotiated with the U.S. and indeed other Western powers as an equal footing was never reasonable, and Western demands should be listened to with care. And it should not be just a disavowal of the nuclear program. It should also be an ending of the ballistic missile project, and especially the funding, arming, training, guiding of proxy militias all over the region that have undermined the sovereignty of an incredible swath of Arab countries and have done great damage, not just to Israel, whom they threaten, but to the Arab countries that they destabilize. And that includes Lebanon and Iraq and Yemen, where almost 500,000 people have died because of the Iran-backed Houthis. And of course, the propping of Bashar Assad in Syria, who's been butchering his own people for 15 years while the Iranians propped him up. I mean, all of this madness has to end. The entire notion that the Persian people were hijacked by this fanatical jihadist Arab project 46 years ago and have been allowed to threaten the Arab world in addition to Israel needs to end. And the last week and a half, where Israel has showed that a much smaller country, but a country with greater wherewithal, can control the skies of this enormous country called Iran, and the Americans can stealthily fly across the planet if need be and do great damage to their nuclear program, should tell the Iranians that now they have to listen to these demands, and now's the time to press them. And the notion that Trump would walk away from this to, bask in the glory of what was a successful mission and a meaningful one is really to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory.
The state of mind in Iran, very clearly, terrific victory. We won.
I mean,
that's a narrative.
They're gonna make public claims that serve them, and currently they are going to try to diminish the degree of their humiliation. You can say what you want, and fool many people much of the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time, even if you control the media. The humiliation visited upon the Iranian regime was tremendous. Israel did what it wanted for 12 days. It hit symbols of the regime. It clearly endangered the life of Khamenei in his own mind because he was hiding in a bunker. He was appointing successors. It decapitated the military and the Revolutionary Guard. If you go through that and you claim a victory, then that's a little bit comic. And if anything, you're showing your weakness because you have to lie transparently.
You shouldn't let the fact confuse you every once in a while,
The fact that we don't know for sure if they removed enriched uranium from Fordo, it underscores the need for negotiations in which Iran, from its position of weakness, will need to be transparent. And they will have to disavow any further effort to reach, to enrich at a weaponizable level. And the carrot that can be given to them is civilian enrichment, because that is their right under the NPT. The previous U.S. position was no enrichment. I can see a way of salvaging their honor. Allowing them to enrich at 3% fully under the supervision of the IAEA, and then we see what happens.
And to that point exactly, there is a notion in Tehran today to suspend the cooperation with the IAEA, Robert.
Not just a notion, they've passed it in the parliament.
Passed one.
It does have additional steps for ratification, but that does seem to be them flexing their muscles in terms of the options that they have. There's definitely one, a series of scenarios by which they may essentially dig their heels in, possibly go down some negotiation route, possibly not. Either way, stalling, whilst if the damage has not been sufficient to the nuclear program, that they then go on and create some limited form of nuclear weapon. That's definitely a scenario that can't be discounted. At the minute, we're hearing multiple conflicting reports, as we've been saying. One of the things that's most important with this, though, is the worst thing when it comes to intelligence assessment is self-deception.
Arash Azizi, contributing writer at The Atlantic, author of The Shadow Commander, joining us live from Boston. Thank you very much, Arash Azizi, for your time. Well, it was only a couple of days ago. Speculation of a regime change, a popular uprising, Farsi Spring were up in the air, and now all gone?
Well, to be honest, nobody who was actually serious about Iranian politics would have would have thought that that was actually workable, or that there would be some sort of a social uprising. I mean, this question had been posed for, for a few years now, that if Israel attacks, will there be something like that happening? And it was always clear to me that it wouldn't, for basic reasons. First of all, people were trying to stay alive, not stage a revolution. And secondly, because there was no organized opposition ready to take power.
Dan Perry, a note on the recent interview with Arash Azizi.
Yeah, well, this issue of regime change that we're all discussing, it was never reasonable to assume that there would be revolution in Iran while it's being bombarded by Israel and the U.S. But rather, the idea was to weaken the regime and humiliate them so much as to incite a certain process. And basically, the less likely scenario is the internal opposition, which is disorganized and so oppressed for years, doing something. Much more likely is some version of a palace coup. If the war had continued and major symbols of the regime, including the parliament building, had been bombarded and more damage had been done and the whole thing was looking unbelievably unstable, it's not inconceivable that some version of the military or some wing of the IRGC would overthrow the clerics. Another possibility is that they're compelled after the death of Khamenei to install a certain version of perestroika, an Islamic Republic light.
All right, we'll be right back with more on, of course, the aftermath of the Iran attack, the ceasefire, what is ahead, but also focusing on what is happening down south in the Gaza Strip and the prospects of an agreement there. Quick break, and we'll be right back. Dan Perry, I will insist on the very same question, this diplomatic momentum or lack thereof. Maybe there is no connection between the successful ceasefire agreement that was reached between Israel and Iran and the ability to reach about a breakthrough down south.
It has to do with the will of a certain limited universe of people. I don't see any diplomatic momentum. I see psychological space, maybe, for creating a paradigm shift because Israel's had this big victory, and maybe that enables Netanyahu to call it a day. But what we see here is this: Israel's military doctrine, since its inception, because it's small territorially and fairly small in terms of population, has been short wars, well-defined on enemy territory, far away from its own territory. And Iran was a textbook case of this, 12 days and done. In Gaza, as many predicted at the get-go, he blundered into a forever war that, does great damage to Hamas, sure, does horrible damage to the Palestinian civilian population, and has no plausible endgame. The endgame really always was one of two things: hurt Hamas badly and then leave in a hostage deal, and it is upsetting to leave Hamas in power, but they've been schooled. Better than a forever war. And the other is to enter a real, better model where a Palestinian government is brought in to replace Hamas, and it probably has to be the PA, which the Israeli government has been denigrating for 2 years because the far-right wing of the government doesn't want that to happen. The PA, in this case, backed by the entire Arab world, the entire West, reformed and so forth, and maybe then pressure can be brought to bear on the remains of Hamas to disarm. Its leaders should go into exile and not remain in the background as a Hezbollah-like entity. Now, the government has both demanded Hamas leave and opposed any alternative to Hamas. This is obviously going to go on forever this way. Maybe Trump, like he basically demanded the war end in Iran, can demand the war ends in Gaza.
In light of the sweeping anti-Semitism in New York City in the wake of October 7th massacre and war against Hamas, the race for the Democratic candidate for mayor particularly consequential. Yesterday's primary proved it. Here's more from our Emily Francis.
Thank you, guys.
It comes down to this. How you feeling today?
I'm feeling good.
Yeah?
All people have to vote. Thank you.
It was a race to the finish and a campaign that has changed the face of New York City.
New Yorkers are hungry for a new kind of politics, a politics that puts working people first. And we're seeing that it's not just in one borough, it's not just with one kind of New Yorker, it's across this entire city.
But still, the race for mayor is up in the air, with Mamdani having to face off in November against incumbent Mayor Eric Adams, seeking re-election as an independent, and of course, Republican candidate Curtis Sliwa. So not the end of it whatsoever. So let's cross now live to the city of Bagel and Lux, editor and columnist of the New York Post, fellow at the Tel Aviv Institute, David Christopher Kaufman, a.k.a. DCK. What is happening?
Happy to be here. Thank you. Yeah, it's been a crazy night in New York City last night. Mamdani clinched what many thought was impossible. You know, he is now the front runner to become the next mayor of New York, a 33-year-old Queens assemblyman who basically has never held public office. And besides being a short-term rapper a couple years ago, he's never really had a job. But this is not entirely unexpected. You know, over the last few weeks, his poll numbers were really spiking. And equally, we began to see sort of a pulling back of Cuomo. You know, the New York Post, where I work, had a column last week basically saying, where the hell is this guy? He's not out campaigning. He's not out championing his cause. He's not out, securing voters. And we had Mamdani, who's young and cute and fun and groovy, walking from the top of Manhattan to the bottom of Manhattan to meet with the voters. And those voters turned out in full force for him.
So what does it mean for the Jewish community in New York?
Yeah, this is a real wake-up call for the Jewish community. I think we don't know yet, because the Jewish community really rallied around Cuomo and really poured, millions and millions and millions of dollars. Cuomo had 3 times the campaign budget of Mamdani, so there was a lot of money poured into Cuomo, and it didn't work. So the question is now, when it comes to the Jewish community, is if it wasn't effective focusing so squarely on the anti-Semitism issue in the primary, and we're trying to get Eric Adams, the current mayor, elected in November, do we focus so heavily on anti-Semitism, or do we coalition build, to use some progressive term, do we coalition build with the real estate community or the pro-police community or, other more sort of mainstream centrist communities and causes, and maybe step back from the anti-Semitism issue? I'm not sure. There's going to be a lot of soul searching this weekend.
Well, as per always, lots of food for thought. Speaking to you, David Christopher Kaufman, thank you very much for your time. Pleasure speaking to you, as always. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you. Good to see you.
Dan Perry, what's the future for New York and for Jews in New York, more particularly?
Well, Jews are a minority in New York. There's more there than anywhere, in any other city, including Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. But Mamdani really leaned into the fact that New York is becoming unaffordable for regular people. He offered this huge raft of populist leftist policies, some of which are very, very appealing, because the Democratic Party, the classic Democratic Party, has refused to do it. He proposes to soak the rich. He has a proposal to issue special city taxes for people with incomes over $1 million. Well, there's relatively few of those. A lot of people don't have that income. Yeah. He benefited from that basic fact. Now, as for the anti-Semitism issue, look, most of the Jews may have voted for him, but not all did. He also, for Cuomo, Mamdani received significant support from regular centrist, liberal, slightly progressive Jews who are fed up with the Israeli government, not only with the situation in Gaza, but the West Bank, the coddling of ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel. There's a disconnect between liberal New York Jews and the Israeli government. That was a factor also,
and yet, speaking of New York City and elsewhere around the world and in the United States being safe for Jews, yes or not?
It's clearly Mamdani is not the messenger for anti-Semitism. He is pro-BDS. He refuses to countenance Zionism. He refuses to admit that Israel is a Jewish state. But he has successfully framed this on several appearances. He had a really good appearance on Stephen Colbert as being against the settlements and not against Israel. Cuomo was a very, very flawed messenger given his age and the fact that he resigned in disgrace from the governorship. Mamdani presented himself as a future, and that oftentimes works. I think David Christopher Kaufman is right that his policies are, as maybe befits a very, very young candidate, historically and almost absurdly young, they're infantile. Yeah. If you're going to have total rent control, then you're going to have a collapse of the real estate market, and that doesn't help anyone. But, it was a perfect storm for him, and it certainly bodes ill for the Jews.
And the question remains whether or not it's an indication to the future greater political landscape in the United States. If the Democratic Party is going in this direction,
There's no doubt that it is. The question is whether it gets past the tipping point where the progressives have become the majority of the Democrats, the way MAGA has become a majority of the Republicans.
Dan Perry, thank you very much for joining us. Robert Swift, you're staying with us for second hour of our special broadcast. Here, a very quick break, and we'll be right back.